Okay, I think we've reached a good critical mass. So if you could just stop sharing for just a moment, and I will introduce you very quickly. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name's Sama Akhtar. I'm the Associate Director of the Vagelos Computational Science Center at Barnard College. And as part of the Year of Science at Barnard, we're hosting this ongoing Diversity in Computing series, which is in its second semester with a new exciting roster of speakers, including our speaker tonight, Matt Mitchell. A little bit more about the series. It features talks from scholars and practitioners in computational field to explore what DEI looks like in STEM, and emerges out of an urgent need to more fully consider the ethical and social implications of computing and its applications. To better understand how to counter these biases in computation, we invite one speaker every month to talk about the work they're doing to diversify and broaden inclusion in their fields by either sharing their research and experiences or their thoughts on how power structures within computing disciplines should be transformed to create more equitable systems. And with that, I'm happy to introduce Matt Mitchell, who is a hacker, founder of CryptoHarlem, and tech fellow to the Build program at the Ford Foundation. In his work there, Matt developed cybersecurity strategy for the foundation's grantee partners. And in 2021, Matt graced the cover of Newsweek magazine, was named one of America's great disruptors. That year, he was also awarded a Pioneer Award by the AFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Finally, Matt is a well-known security researcher, operational security trainer, and data journalist who founded and leads CryptoHarlem, which holds impromptu workshops teaching basic cryptography tools to the predominantly African-American community in Upper Manhattan. And with that, I will hand that over to Matt. Thank you for joining us today.
Boom. Thanks for the handover. I appreciate it. Thank you all for joining me. And I'm going to try to speak for 40 minutes or something close to that. And we could do like 20 minutes Q&A. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay, awesome. So let me just pull up my slides, buckle up, and I'll see you at the end of the show. Okay, so my presentation, right, to CSC Diversity in Computing series is called Solved, Easy Fixes for Algorithmic Bias, which is kind of a joke, honestly. There's all these threads about how to fix bias in algorithms in machine learning. And they always talk about everything but something that I think is the best way to solve it. And it's the only way that we're going to have any safety or protection for the folks who are impacted. In that, I say that one of the most impactful and concrete solutions to algorithmic bias is having a diverse team of researchers, analysts, critics to conduct the work. This is something that is quickly glanced over, but in this conversation, we'll focus on the inconvenient truth of this reality. And everything we know about fighting bias the right way, as I would say, right, is by we're just lucky to have Earth's greatest heroes, kind of like the Avengers of real life. We're just doing this work every single day. And it takes a lot of research, a lot of work, a lot of papers, a lot of professionalism, a lot of grassroots activism. It takes a whole network for us to push back against the dangers and biases in technology. So we're going to talk about some of who these amazing human beings are, the work that they do, how you yourself can get involved, and then I'll answer all the questions you have. We already talked about me, so this is not that important, but I'm a hacker, I'm a security researcher. I founded this thing called CryptoHarlem, which is in Harlem, just like Barnard and Columbia. And yeah, what else is that? I mean, like I'm at Ford Foundation now as a technology fellow, where I work on cybersecurity issues, and Ford Foundation's Build program is a great place. We do multi-year funds for nonprofits around the world. The Ford Foundation, if you're not familiar, is an 80-year-old philanthropy that provides grants to many of the nonprofits you know, and maybe some you don't know, all around the world in their fight against inequality, which is like our mission. Those grants amount to something like $500 million to $1 billion a year, which is a lot of dollars. So I was looking at Twitter like I do every day. Like I wake up and I just check Twitter. So this was like on Twitter today. for me, because I guess I missed it yesterday. My friend Sarah had posted this US military program that uses like artificial intelligence to kind of help you make decisions on the battlefield. And I was thinking, wow, I can't believe this is real. And of course, she asked, like, what could possibly go wrong? And, there's this idea that if computers make the decisions, then the decisions are going to be like scientific and balanced and neutral, and there'll be no bias. And, whether it's computers flying helicopters, that DARPA did that in the past, or computers helping you decide what to do when, I was reading the article and it talks about during the exit of Afghanistan by US forces, there was unfortunately a bombing at the airport, and it was so much chaos and people didn't know what to do. And what if a computer was there to help you decide? So I was just like, wow, wild. But anyway, speaking about Twitter, Twitter has a team called the Machine Learning, Ethics, Transparency, and Accountability Team, or Meta, which is weird because this team was called Meta before Facebook changed their name, but now it's just very confusing. And they do a lot of really cool stuff. So, I don't just look at Twitter as a user and check out the social stuff. I like to research and get into and dig into all the different tech teams doing positive work. And it's interesting that this team actually exists inside a tech company. So let's learn a little bit about them and just kind of dive in real quick, right? So this is their Responsible Machine Learning Initiative, which they talk about like how Twitter is trying to use machine learning, and which is like when you're giving a huge amount of data to a machine, a computer, it learns. I guess you're more like training it, like you train a puppy or something with this data, and then it can find correlations and patterns in that data. And from that, you get to a place where you can tease out the AI side, which is artificial intelligence, which are actions and decisions based on rules, right? This is Yuta, and this is Ruman Chowdhury, who's an amazing human being. They also wrote this another piece, which I think is really awesome to check out. And it talks about political content on Twitter and how the algorithm displays or hides or changes what it might show you based on information and what their researchers found. And what they do is really look behind the curtain and try to understand why users are experiencing something when they're experiencing it. Now, Twitter is not the only company to have a team that tries to work to the benefit of researchers and the planet. At Facebook, they have a responsible AI team that's called the AI Red Team. And they made something like, I guess it's about a year ago, called Casual Conversations data set, which sounds so chill. It's like just a casual conversation. But what it actually is a lot of pieces of data that you would need to prove that something is in, with the sound, audio, visual, video, pictures, whether there's an issue with diversity, right? With bias, with, not treating all human beings the same, right? Here's an article from IEEE Spectrum, which kind of talks about this. And in it, they say, like, are AI algorithms playing fairly with age, gender, skin color, et cetera? And with all this research that you could use free from Facebook, you can help prove and find things, et cetera. But the difference between Facebook and Twitter, I found, and I really liked, is how Twitter really turns all of their team, like, research against themselves or internally towards themselves. And they're really open about finding problems in their AI models, right? And trying to repair them, especially issues of bias in those models, right? And to that effect, the team at Twitter decided to try this really interesting thing. So like, there was an issue where users of Twitter, just regular folks like you and me, were finding strange things. And there are a lot of examples of it. And this is how it starts. You're on the other side, the last stop of the data. And they were seeing that if you upload an image to Twitter, it doesn't just show you the image like from wherever the middle of the picture is. It looks at the image using like computer vision, computer imaging, and then it decides what part of the image to focus on. And what users found were, if those images were of people of color, Black and brown folks, certain other people, it would not ever like highlight them. It would highlight someone else. Like I think there's a famous example, almost like a meme where it's a picture of former U.S. President Obama. Barack Obama is in one side of the picture. It's a really long strip, and then there's something else in the picture, and that's what the AI kept on cropping and centering, right? And this could be problematic because you can end up with an entire experience where a community, a whole people are erased, right? And erasure is a big problem, and we kind of go back to it in my presentation, but a different kind of erasure. Anyway, Twitter was like, look, we already fixed that. Like the Meta team looked at that. We appreciate everyone for raising that up, but we're going to do this thing that's almost unheard of during DEF CON, which is a cybersecurity computer hacker conference, happens in Vegas every year. We're going to invite people to just look at our algorithm. We have some Python code, which is part of the actual Twitter AI. And we're going to allow you to just interpret it, tweak it, interrogate it, twist it around, break it, and try to see if you could find anything that we haven't found yet about bias. And this is already after the cropping was fixed. And it was really cool. And I was asked to be one of the judges for and one of the panelists for this contest. And so they worked with HackerOne, which is a company that makes it easier for people to do these things called bug bounties, where the general public can just kick the tires, try to hack within parameters and find what's wrong. And it was really fascinating. And people only have like 7 or 8 days to look at this code. And it wasn't just researchers. It wasn't just academics. It wasn't just university students, right? It wasn't just PhDs and grad students. It was anyone in the world who wanted to fill out a form, download the code, see what they could find. And so what did they find? Drum roll. There's no surprises here. Water is wet. Well, this is a wild headline that says, Twitter's racist algorithm is also ageist, ableist, and Islamophobic, researchers found, right? So, and in it, there were a lot of different submissions from a lot of different people. There was a really cool one that I really liked, which was like, what about someone whose head is covered for whatever reason, right? Whether they're wearing, a nun is wearing a habit, or a woman's wearing a hijab, or whatever it might be going on, right? So, like the algorithm just didn't see them as a person anymore. Another thing was if you're wearing a uniform, or if you're older, the algorithm was like, maybe you're not a person. Maybe I shouldn't display you to people, right? Another article on the findings talked about the photocropping algorithm prefers young, beautiful, and light-skinned faces. So yeah, I mean, that also was a finding that a researcher just sent a bunch of faces in, and preferential treatment were displayed to certain faces over others. And I thought this was fascinating because not only was this open to the public, not just being on the end user side to find things, but really being able to tweak things and test things, but open to anyone. And so much awesome things were found, right? And I kept on thinking about what a community can do to protect everyone from bias in machine learning and AI. So the same person here, before she was working at Twitter, she was a data scientist who was like putting ethics in AI, right? And this is an article that Ruman Chowdhury had written from the Meta team, right? And it talks about how, to disrupt, tech needs to listen to actual researchers. And it talks about how like there's a difference between the academic research, and what I would add is there's a difference between the academic research, what the researchers find, what the community of activists out there find, and what the tech companies do. And this is like, before she was at Meta, I believe, right? And this is something that really helps. If you're a tech company and you hire a researcher, you hire a critic, right? This is like, I think like what that Twitter example shows us is the power that they can add to your team and the positive outcomes that you can get from doing that. And obviously, this is an article here in Protocol, says how Twitter hired tech's biggest critics to build ethical AI. And that's what the Meta team is. The Meta team really is like an all-star team, even though they work within the company and they are Twitter employees. They're using all of their research, all of their perspective, all of their activism, all of their personal thoughts and thinking, and applying it to a product which they now can know intimately. They can get like, past that NDA and see the real code, and positive things are happening, right? Boom. But this isn't just something for companies and tech companies to do. There's a whole world of organizations that are nonprofits, who are activists, who are challenging like the state of AI and machine learning, and we really need them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those organizations here, starting with Fight for the Future, which Fight for the Future looks at a lot of different issues and how technology impacts people and the future and the world that we're in. And the thing I really like about Fight for the Future is they're very holistic and they look at a lot of things, including AI. And the team for Fight for the Future, again, it's a team that's, and what I find and what you'll continue to see in this presentation are mostly women-led organizations, right? People of color, queer folks, trans folks, right? Marginalized communities. And I think that's not by accident. I think, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more, the numbers kind of show us, they're being on the margins, being like that group that is on the intersection of so many identities also means that you're holding a lot and you've got a lot of skin in the game. Like, your community is one of the ones that bias in AI is going to impact or affect negatively first. And I think that's part of why we see that so much in, the people who are fighting on the front lines. Boom. So this is the Algorithmic Justice League, and the Algorithmic Justice League is a really cool team. They're run out of MIT, right? And you might have seen the movie Coded Bias by, this is Joy Bolwini, who is like the protagonist or the main researcher and the person who's followed in that movie. It's on streaming platform Netflix. So if you haven't seen Coded Bias, I recommend you check it out. And what they do is they use their software engineering, their machine learning, their artificial intelligence, their algorithmic understanding hat, and they use that to make a lot of these issues more accessible to the general public, and also to talk to tech companies in the language that they know, which is code, right? Oftentimes, when you're advocating for positive change and you're saying like, well, we think this is bad for a certain community, or we think that this might be racist or biased or misogynistic or sexist or whatever, right? A lot of the answer, the knee-jerk reaction you'll get is, well, you just don't understand the code, or maybe you need to just run it a couple times just looking at it as a user. And one thing of the many things I love about AJL is they're experts on this, and they can go have those high-level conversations, which is really necessary. And in my work, I find is crucial if you want to have change happen. And you need a lot of different types of organizations. You need grassroots organizations, but to have engineers talking to engineers is a very powerful thing. This is that team there, right? Awesome faces in Halloween costumes in this particular picture at AJL. Then there's me, of course, shameless plug, CryptoHarlem. I say CryptoHarlem is cybersecurity for the people, and we focus on anti-surveillance, cybersecurity education and advocacy, but also training, right? Because you're already going to be someone who feels like I must fight the machines for what's right and to protect my community. And if the only thing stopping you from doing that to the higher level is like learning some Python, maybe we can teach you some Python, right? So, we have classes and courses that we run where we teach people how to take apart algorithms and how to look at AI, how to do adversarial AI, where you're kind of like attacking the AI and deciphering the logic behind it and trying to find, is there bias here? Is there a problem here? Also, how to responsibly communicate that to whoever might have created this, technology, wherever you might see it or find it, right? Boom. And a cool group that also works in Harlem and other parts of New York City are the Gangs Coalition. And, they're focused on something that's like called the gang database, right? I think it's called something like the criminal identities or criminal person database that the NYPD has. And this is, basically, it's a list of human beings, and you don't know if you're on this list. But if you ever have contact with, a lot of people find out during like a court appearance or hearing, where someone will say, hey, this person's also on the gang database. You're like, wait, I am, right? So what they want is to understand what are the rules, what is the model that lands someone on this list that only the NYPD has access to, and what allows, and you to not be on that list, right? And what is the thinking? What's the logic there, right? So GANG stands for Grassroots Advocates for Neighborhood Groups and Solutions, and I like that. I like that they're kind of like challenging what does the word mean in the very name of their organization. I've gone to events and kind of like info shares and rallies that they've planned, and they're really solid and awesome people. And one thing I love about them is what they show is there's part of this amazing patchwork solution that's pushing back against AI bias. And you don't need to be a programmer. You could be someone who's directly affected. You could be someone who wants to learn more. You could be, and they have such a diverse group that I really love working with them, right? Boom. Okay. The Distributed AI Research Institute, or DARE, right? They were started by Timnit Gebru, who was an AI researcher at Google, who was dismissed from Google controversially, right? Because of findings that she was trying to make, send up to her management and share with other researchers, right? But instead of silencing Timnit, now she's free to do amazing things. DARE is now like funded and supported by a lot of different funders and philanthropies, and they're an amazing team. Boom. So in the upper left corner, you have the fearless leader, founder, and executive director, Timnit Gebru, right? Who's a genius and an expert and a PhD, former Googler, and now someone who's like working with the rest of society to like really take apart and meet AI from like the highest levels, right? And also coming up with ways that other researchers can look out and prevent bias, right? It's not like a switch you can flip or a part of your code that you can delete. It's something that you have to be forever vigilant on and you have to care about. And I think, again, like the team themselves are all amazing human beings, engineers, researchers who could be doing anything else, but choose to spend so much of their energy protecting all of us. And, I just feel like so much props to them. All right. Okay, cool. Another organization is Data for Black Lives. I'm not sure if you are familiar with Data for Black Lives, but it is kind of like what it sounds like. They are a group of, and kind of like in the, we saw this kind of year of racial reckoning, the George Floyd protest. Data for Black Lives has been around for a few years, right? And really it's like, look, if you are a data scientist, regardless of how you identify or what you look like, let's look at what we can do to protect Black folks from the damages and harms that technology are causing, right? And how technology is negatively impacting that community. Excuse me. So the team at Data for Black Lives, there's Yeshi, who I used to work with a whole lifetime ago at a completely different organization called Color for Change, who leads that group. I mean, an amazing group of her co-founder, researchers, etc. There's Tawana Petty, who is like an all-star in her own right, known for her work in Detroit, and several others. And I would say, like, they have a conference, they have events as well. And it's just a solid team that, I think like more people need to know. I'm not going to name every single person on every single slide though, because, for time purposes, but I will make sure that you all get a copy of these slides so that you can dig deeper into this. Okay. So I've just shown you some of the people who are fighting so hard, right? Many without so much recognition against bias in artificial intelligence, against bias in machine learning. But let's take a look at like what is this field of data science and look at some data on data science. Okay. So Reveal, which is the Center for Investigative Reporting, they in 2018 finally got their hands on EEO1, which is the United States federal like data on who works at a particular place, right? So this isn't a percentage, like 10% of our staff are Asian or something like that. It's the actual numbers of how many Black engineers work at Google or something like that, right? And the funny thing is, or not so funny, is that Silicon Valley, all these tech companies were fighting tooth and nail to different degrees based on the company hiding this data. They didn't want it published. They didn't want it easy to find. A lot of them don't fill out the EEO ones because it's like there's a a huge extent. It's basically could be voluntary act, right? Although thanks to this reporting and this work, it's changed. But there's no surprise here. What they found is that the data is really bad, and that tech companies, technologies companies, they don't hire Black folks. They don't hire brown folks. They don't hire people of color. They don't hire queer folks. Like it's just the data that kind of like cements your assumption. Okay. This is the slide. They have this like animated GIF slide, which I recommend looking at the reporting from 2018 and 2019 on Reveal. It's really quite fascinating. And it explains, like, even though, there's so many qualified candidates, they just don't see those levels of diversity working inside the companies. And this is to my point of why it's so bad. And, if there's an algorithm that's supposed to be like, let's say, processing resumes, but is accidentally finding anything that might seem that you're a woman or self-identify as a woman and ruling you out and taking you out of a job pool, right? If you're a woman researcher, you're likely to just kind of find that because you're going to like, why is my algorithm at work not like, why is it throwing my data out, right? So there really is this idea that on the very surface, if you're the researcher working on the data, the algorithm, the machine learning, you're gonna, say like, hey, why is it not working for me? Like what happened with Joy from Algorithmic Justice League. In the photo, she's wearing a white mask, or she has that, and encoded bias is displayed in that movie because she was working with computer vision, and the computer vision system could not see her because of the complexion of her skin. And when she put this like white mask on, then it could see her because of that contrast, right? So here, the largest group that's hired inside a tech company inside the United States are Asian folks. But even then, more men than women, and not to a high level. And there's a drop off. Anyone who you might call a professional, like you just get a job and you're coding, right? You're not in services and you're not in operations. You're kind of like in that part of the company. But as you go higher up the ladder, you'll see less and less representation. And as you go higher up to where decisions can be made, especially difficult decisions, like the ones that are like, what do we do with this product that might be problematic? You're going to find less representation by people who are different, different groups of folks, right? And of course, the numbers are ridiculously abysmal for Black folks, right? One of the things I do at CryptoHarlem is I say, because we're just open to anyone in the community. It's like, hey, what's your favorite app on your phone? And everyone screams out their favorite app. And I'm like, hey, do you know how many people work in that company look like you? And they're always like, oh, I don't even know. I'm like, how many people do you think work at Twitter anyway, like total? And then how many do you think are Black folks or whatever, right? And, it's so sad because the numbers that people come up with, they range, but they're always wrong because the representation is really, really low, right? And again, same thing. The higher up you go in decision-making and power, the less representation we see. And for Latinx folks, same thing, right? Basically mirroring what we see for Black folks, like slightly better, right? And also, we see that women always lower than men, right? And this is just like a larger representation of just showing like the difference between men and women when it comes to, again, like where you are. And as you go up, the one needle that goes up, of course, are like cis white males going up. As you go higher up the ladder to more decision making, there's more representation from that group inside every company, right? So this is a separate piece of data. One thing I think it's always challenging is when I want to show separate things, but these are completely different data sources, okay? So this data source is from Zippia, which is a career job website. and they poll users of their website and they do some research based on that information. So one thing I want to make sure is like you just see that even though it's showing you the same general picture, because the truth is the truth, the numbers are going to be a little different. For example, they found that there's 2,871 data scientists in the United States. That's not the total number of data scientists in the United States. That's the number of data scientists in the United States that were in their polling group, right? But then you'll see here some averages, right? Like the average age is someone who's 39. The average gender, 65% male. Race, 66% white. And then, of course, it says the most common degree reached is a bachelor. So you have a picture here of like who is behind, the code that we might be using, right? Of course, there's going to be this very serious issue of a pay gap. And all of this is affecting why you might go into this field, right? Like, so if I'm talking to you and I'm like, hey, we need you to get into data science, be a data scientist. And you're like, oh, how much does a data scientist make? Well, it's not the same for you because you are a woman, right? It's not the same for anyone who self-identifies as a woman. It's not the same also based on your race, right? So all of these things affect why not only are you going to see less representation, right? You're going to have less people studying with you, less people in the job market with you, less people on the teams with you who look like you, who understand the community you're coming from, who understand what you're dealing with. You're also going to get paid less. And you're going to get, the more of intersections or identities on, the less you're going to get paid. And so what we find is, we need that representation to fight back and push back, but it's so hard to find it inside the companies because of this friction, right? And so here we see, data scientists from their list of like almost 3,000. This is what the breakdown is like fully by race. Again, it's like 1% Black. Oops. Okay. And here is that same kind of like wage gap, but instead of by gender, it's a wage gap by race, right? And I know like they have like a very binary gender identity that they did in their polling where it's just like male, white male, woman, whatever, right? So it doesn't even show the full spectrum of gender identities, right? And here with race, you'll see again, like if you're a Black researcher, AI researcher, and you do happen to get a job, you become that 1% inside a tech company, you're also going to get paid less, right? Okay, we're almost to question time. I just want to talk about another company that had a team that I worked with in the past. It was really cool being invited to speak with them on a panel, and that's NVIDIA. AI and graphics are tied together because of the computational expense or energy, the power needed to do artificial intelligence. You'll find that in the world, we had a lot of advances with natural language processing, teaching a computer to play chess, whatever that is. But we hit a ceiling because we had no machines that could process things that fast. And then with graphics cards, there's a huge explosion of artificial intelligence. And to this day, NVIDIA, which is a graphics card company, they have a conference called GTC, and it's heavily focused on artificial intelligence and machine learning. And Anima in this picture, she is the director of their machine learning and AI studies at that graphic card company. And she does a lot of great work. And I was on a panel with her and Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee. And Dr. Lee works at Brookings. Dr. Lee had authored this report, Algorithmic Bias Detection and Mitigation, Best Practices and Policies to Reduce Consumer Harms. It's actually like an easy read. It's like basically like the length of a magazine, a long magazine article. I would recommend it. She also wrote it with Paul Resnick and Jeannie Barton. And Anima, she's really pretty prolific. She has like so much research and so many papers, of course, as you'd imagine, as the director of AI and machine learning. She also teaches at Caltech. She's a professor there. But she has an interview on this podcast, which I will direct you to, called the Radical AI Podcast. And it's about democratizing AI, inclusivity, accountability, and collaboration. And what I do see is like when you do see this like 1%, 2%, 3% inside tech companies, these are men and women who are doing like 1,000% of so much energy and work to protect all of us, to protect the communities they're part of, the communities they have solidarity and care about as well. So I just want to make sure that we talked about that. She also works for the AI for Science initiative. And there's a YouTube video, which I also want to steer you to, that Anima's in, and it's about generalizable AI, which is a slightly different issue, but it talks about how, AI is designed to do certain things, and they're completely important tasks that it does not consider. And a lot of the issues that are negative, that are that are amplified, the bias that's the kind of garbage in, garbage out of AI models, they come from AI not being able to notice that it's doing something wrong, right? And so generalizable AI is like, there's something there that can be used to protect the worst of AI, bias being on that list. Okay, so this is the talk I was in. It's called Measuring and Mitigating Bias in AI Models. You can check that out. You have to like sign up, and it's free. I would check that. I'm gonna try to just end now so we can just go to questions, okay?
Thank you so much, Matt. That was wonderful. I am going to start off with a quick question while people are thinking. And so really encourage anyone who wants to either turn their cameras on or unmute themselves or put their questions in the chat if you have a question for Matt. I was inspired by all the examples and organizations and kind of from the ground up organizations that are doing a lot of the work. And you did mention at the end that oftentimes in these places like Twitter, for example, you have one or two people that are doing a lot of the work, and they tend to be
way out beyond a lot.
Yeah, they tend to be like either people of color or women of color or women. And so basically from underrepresented categories.
That's correct.
Okay. So on the one hand, your title is called Solved. So I was really excited to hear not just a perspective from somebody who's looking at bias from a critical angle, but also trying to offer like solutions, right?
Yes.
And so what is something that you would say about a lot of the burden that falls on people of color or women who are in these organizations, like Ramon, for example, who's doing like lifting a really heavy load with Meta, right?
Yeah.
And she's doing some really great work there. But then also on the other hand, we heard today that they're appointing Elon Musk to their board. And so
Yes.
I'm just curious about your thoughts on these kind of like opposing forces that are happening in an organization like Twitter, which you kind of present as an example that is like kind of moving in a positive direction, right? Compared to like,
definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would say a company exists, in like a capitalist society to grow and get more money. And, I'm sure like that's going to help Tesla, SpaceX, Twitter stock, all the people who are into that stuff, right? They're not like, this is great for algorithmic bias and the communities are negatively impacted by the harms of technology. That's not what that's about. And, I try to be constructive and solution based. That's kind of like where I live. And look, no one's gonna come to save us. And if we do nothing, we're toast, right? So we've got to dig deep and do that heavy lifting, but we're used to that heavy lifting because that's a burden that's always been asked, and brought to us. So obviously it's exhausting being I don't have to tell you, a woman of color in academia, right? And you represent so much to so many people, but you're living people's hopes and dreams. You're kicking open doors. You're a positive role model, but you're carrying more weight than everyone else. But I say, you know what? It's like CrossFit every day, and we're just going to be super strong and put our backs into it. The more of us that we have, the less weight any of us needs to hold as one person. So regardless what happens in the C-suite or in the boardroom or on the stock level, we have a job to do. And that's like not being toast, right? Not giving up, not game over. We're going to be underpaid for it. We're going to be undervalued for it. We're going to be, underappreciated and underestimated. But you know what? The last laugh will be on us. So I hope that I can like have an inspirational but truthful conversation with you all about it.
Thank you for that. Are there
Thank
any
you.
questions? Okay, so we have a question in the chat. Do you think confirmation bias can also be a problem when correctly identifying if an algorithm is biased or not? Like going into the investigation already assuming there will be bias in the algorithm and you wrongly find it where there is actually no bias.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I live to hunt for bias in algorithms. So I'm just assuming every algorithm is biased and racist and horrible, right? But you approach it not from an emotional place. You approach it scientifically. And that's the thing about machine learning and models. And when you're looking for best practices to like rule out bias, for example, with that that like tool that was supposed to be designed to process applicants faster and help people get matched to jobs faster, they were using a historic data set, which is, you know, everyone who ever got hired by any company that they had, right? And they would be like, oh, look at the resumes. Let's feed it to this machine. They weren't thinking that sociology and reality will tell us that, you know, Barnard exists for a reason, right? Columbia was like men only. So if you look at the historic data set, you're going to be like, oh, look at all these great students and valedictorians and all the other stuff. And they're all men from up until this point in like 1980, whatever, or 1970, whatever. So without any thinking, you're going to create a computer that's like, we need to get more men in here if we want to raise the GPAs of everybody, right? So that's exactly what happened with that data set. It was thinking, well, there's a point where there's like no women working here at all. So there must be some reason for that. And it doesn't realize. So when you're actually doing this work, it's hard to make something up, right? It's very ones and zero. It's very science in a lab. So if you're like, I think that Facebook's, you know, I don't know, featured post is racist, right? You're not using anecdotal examples by like you and 100 of your friends to prove that. You're actually going to do it from and that's why my work is to inspire folks to kind of like raise the level of their research, because that's not a real conversation you're going to have in the rooms that I'm in when you're like, look what happened when on my phone and my friend's phone, right? Like you're going to need to be like, well, look, I'll sign an NDA. Let me look at the code. Let me show you where this training data goes wrong. Let me show you the historic reason for that, blah, blah, blah. If you can't have that conversation, you're going to get laughed out the room. So it's actually hard to fake, you know, to have that. So yeah, you have that like kind of confirmation bias, that idea like, oh, this thing is wrong and it's going to be wrong. But the way that you measure and improve it, there is no way to really like, you know, or I wouldn't say there's no way, but it's hard to get that wrong. That's one good thing about evil computers. They're still computers, right? There's still code, there's still logs, there's still data. Great point and great question.
We have one question in the chat, but we also have a hand raised. So Valerie, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi, I'm Valerie Bar, Mount Holyoke College. Thrilled to be able to get into this event. I was a little late. But I want to ask a follow-up question because I keep asking people this question and nobody's given me a satisfactory answer. So
okay, I'm going to try.
Yeah. So with the Amazon case, with the resume hunting software that turned out to be so bad, I'm not a machine learning person. I never pretend to be one. What I don't understand is why couldn't Amazon have taken their bad training data and said, okay, we're going to go through this training data and we're going to replace half the names with female names, and we're going to replace half the undergraduate institutions with women's colleges, and we're going to replace half of the extracurricular activities with women's softball and women's lacrosse and all of that, and then just train the tool again. They threw it out. They said, this is irredeemable. We're going to throw it out. And I guess, so my higher level question is, why can't we engineer data, training data, so that it has the diversity that we want the tool to find when it's in operational use? Would it be wrong for them to have engineered the data?
I think when you engineer the data, you don't need to engineer the data per se. You can actually just teach the model, right? Like, here's what happened. There was this thing where there were less people working there. Like to your point, right? Like obviously if they had some women researchers working at Amazon when they were running some of this stuff, same thing happens to a lot of different companies when they're doing this kind of employment stuff, they would have noticed it right away. Like, hey, how come my resume just keeps getting kicked out? Like, that makes no sense, right? So what you would do is you would just, like you say, it's not irreparable, right? We can't change the past of this planet, right? We only can make a better future. It's not irreparable. And I would say that there's not a reason there is no reason to just throw out, like they say, the baby with the bathwater. There's no reason to throw everything out. But what you do need to do is really interrogate, where did we make a mistake? And what I suspect is the mistake wasn't just so easy. It might have been in the core logic, the model itself, the thing that all the data gets fed into, right? And what the researchers and the individuals, the organizations that I speak to, and I highlight some of them in this presentation, they love technology. They love data. And there's no getting the toothpaste back in the tube. Like, we're not going to like stop AI. It's like, that's not going to happen. But what we can do is we can just say, like, what are the best practices that we can do to make sure things don't go sideways? And if you're running something that has to do with employment, or something that has to do with anything where you're not, like, you should always check for these like gender bias in your algorithm, especially like employment, especially with education, especially with institutions that traditionally were misogynistic, if not sexist, right? And let's come up with better models. Let's come up with ways that we can still get to something where we could process 1,000 resumes in 1 minute. And I think that we can do that. And like, to your point, so yes, it's the reason people throw things out is bad PR, bad, maybe the code itself was like rot to the core, right? But it doesn't mean we can't try again. We must try again. Because otherwise what'll happen is there'll be technologies that will be processing people quickly, and other technologies which a human must be part of, and for reasons of like fairness or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's not good either, right? Because that's going to slow things down for everyone, right? So I hope that makes sense. And yeah, you're not wrong. That's very smart. It's good logic. And, I think you got some AI classes in your future. We might need your help there. Thanks, Valerie.
We have a question from a Barnard student. So Zoe, can I ask this very quick before your question? Okay, great. So she says that she feels like meaningful representation is touted from a DEI perspective as being the solution, but she thinks there are so many situations where nominally there is more representation, but it actually means nothing. So she wanted to ask whether you could talk more about what these entities, so I'm assuming the bigger corporations, need to be prioritizing overall, and how representation may add to that.
Well, I'm not saying, like, if you take the reality of who's writing this code right now, right? And you're just like, look, the code you're writing is dangerous. It could hurt certain communities, but I've never been hurt. I'm not part of one of those communities. The world is perfect for me. Look at my stats. I'm getting paid more than the person who does the same job as me based on my gender identity because I'm male, and I have a higher position for no reason, right? So it's hard to get that person to get to a place where they're thinking, slow things down, a few more sprints of writing this code, a few more deadlines, stretch it out. Got to keep going, got to find this bias, right? A bias that I've never experienced. It doesn't affect my life in any way. Okay, that's a hard sell, right? So I'm not saying it's impossible, right? To turn your average like white cis tech bro into a woke, anti-bias developer, AI model creator, whatever, right? But it's just not as easy as being like, wow, look at this thing. It's dumping all the women's resumes to the garbage. And you're like, I'm a woman. That's horrible. Let's stop this. It's just a lot easier. But and if you look at the numbers, it's not like there is some representation. 1%, 5%, it's not. And when you talk to the professionals that are there, the frustrations that they feel, it's real. And they don't have power. There's not representation on a management level or a C-suite level to even the groups that are there. They're trying to do stuff like, every tech company still has like Black employees at Twitter or like Asian employees at Google. And, they're trying, but it's you know, when you run the numbers and you see the actual human beings, it's not like there is any kind of representation. Because just because there's another Asian, Black, South Asian, Latino, Latinx, queer, trans, whatever person working with you, and you're both 0.5% or 1%, you made it somehow, you might not be on the same team. You might not all work in AI. You might not be machine learning. The numbers for that are even less. So I would just say, yeah, no, it's worse. It's really, really, really bad. And there aren't examples of that in reality in the places where we would hold so much of this happens, right? Like NVIDIA has I was at that session. I can talk to you about the director of AI and research. They have abysmal diversity numbers, right? And, so it's like, are we going to say, hey, that's the fault of the director of AI and machine learning? Wow, there's only so much she could do. She's not in charge of hiring, right? So she's not able to, she's like the highest you could go there when it comes to the AI team. But it's not a team that's mostly women. It's not a team that's mostly, Black or brown folks. So there's a lot of issues there. So hope that answers, that. But I try to stay evidence-based. I try to stick 100% to the data. I would just point you to the reveal numbers, the EO1 numbers, and, make your own, come to your own conclusion.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we have a follow-up question from Rebecca Wright, and Zoe, I think, can conclude with the final question.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Great talk.
Thank you.
And I think I like your sort of combination of optimism and pessimism.
Yeah.
It's a really effective way to approach this kind of problem. But I did want to talk about, so this is related to the last question and your answer. One of the ways I've often viewed this is that it is necessary in order to actually sort of make tech a better place and produce better results. It's necessary to have a more diverse workforce. As you say, you need people sort of in there with their personal experiences to notice and be aware of problems, as well as like social justice reasons that you want like more access to these good jobs.
Right. But it's good for the bottom line. So you're right. It's necessary for even the most non-social justice.
Exactly.
reason.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I also worry that it's not sufficient. Like even if you have workforces that sort of better reflect the population as a whole, maybe unless and until you see that really filter all the way up through the management, through the executives, through the cultures of the companies, they're not necessarily empowered to make that change. And especially if it remains kind of pockets and so I wonder how you see that pathway of really getting to the point of the diversity itself leading to the change, or whether it's just we have to do it all and keep moving on all fronts at all times.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of things. It's the shareholders, right? It's the board or board of directors. It's also, the vice president level, right? We have to see diversity in those places. Otherwise, look, I can tell you all the superheroes who are doing like, swinging way beyond like, everything and doing amazing work. But, there's only so long before they get frustrated or burn out, or like, that's one human being. What if they just get a raise or decide to just go somewhere else or whatever, so, but there is something to be said for the funnel, right? Like we have this many people come through the door and that drop that becomes a vice president from that. So if we increase the funnel, we will by default increase the executives, right? So it's like, okay, this is a company that tends to hire from within. And because that amazing project was led by this team, someone from that project got invited to get a promotion, they decided to take it, right? So it's just about, I look at the political situation going on in Eastern Europe and the conflict in Ukraine. And, if you were to say like, look, the entire Russian military is going to basically try to take one city. And, people were like 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, Kiev will fall, right? Why is it week 7, right? And against all odds, there's something to be said about human resiliency and human spirit. And raw numbers don't always work. It's about a certain level of passion, a certain level of focus. And what I hope with my optimistic, like realism, maybe not pessimism, is to inspire you to join the ranks on this fight on whatever side, inside the corporation or inside the kind of like nonprofit type group, because we desperately need you, but we really need you to be a shareholder. We really need you to be on the board. really, really need you to be a VP. Get there, start there. However, understanding what it takes, so much easier to get hired for obvious reasons. You're going to be like, well, you're the diversity hire for the VP or the board position, is to have the time in the company, right? And the political will that you build from working your way up the ranks. It's just the easier path from what I've seen in my anecdotal experience.
And
Thank you
we'll
so much,
take
Rebecca.
one more question, if that's okay, from Zoe.
I dropped my question in the chat, but I can go ahead and ask it now. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your work at CryptoHarlem and what it like what sort of like on a practical level, because I think I hear about like anti-surveillance work and digital self-defense, and I don't think I actually know quite what that looks like. So maybe, what that looks like. And what that
I mean, it looks like a lot of things. Like there's this group, there was some article about them like this week. They're called like Gen Z for something. They're just basically like hacking forums and like making things like all this like really like logical, really smart things. It's kind of like when the K-pop army were just like, hey, you know what? We're just gonna flood this, buy tickets to this event and whatever, right? So just really cool stuff. It really inspires me. What we do with CryptoHarlem is we inspire people to take whatever action they feel they must do for a positive outcome, right? And we talk about the levels of surveillance that all human beings are on, right? By just existing in this space, but the layers of it that exist only in the inner city. And, if you're, like right now it's Ramadan. So, if you're a Muslim in New York, there's just a different level of surveillance that comes with your identity, right? Like if you're queer in New York, if you're a sex worker in New York, there's many levels of surveillance that come with your identities. And folks in the inner city, it's like someone who's living in like a Terminator 2 reality, but they're standing right next to you, and what we do is we talk about all of the different surveillance technologies that are there, whether they're from a corporation or law enforcement, federal authority, or the state or the city of New York, how it got there, different things that we can do to understand technically how it works, because most of it's kind of complicated, and then actions we can take that we must take to limit its use, right? And curtail that. So like I worked with the ACLU on this thing called CCOPS at the time, which was community control over police surveillance. We would find, oh yeah, the NYPD has like radiation van that can see through walls. Totally sounds ridiculous, but it's real, right? But oftentimes we would find these technologies upon use or being like somehow blatantly shown. Now we have the Post Act in New York, which says that the police must show us the surveillance technology, right? So it's like something like police oversight of surveillance technologies, right? So NYPD had to write, like, these are all the technologies that we have. It's all taxpayer money. This is how we use it. And also these are civil liberty issues we're looking out for or not looking out for and things like that. That's not the true reality of it. I mean, there's obviously a lot of, it's very difficult to get them to reveal and unveil like all these things that are out there, but only when we understand it can we have conversations about it, right? So I think that's what CryptoHarlem does. It's like, look, I'm not telling folks that we shouldn't have all these cameras everywhere or we should have all these sensors everywhere, but let's just put it out. If we put it everywhere in New York, everyone will be completely creeped out and everyone will be up in arms and we'll have a great conversation about it. But right now, it's only certain pockets of our city that are experienced that. Like there's a robot dog NYPD had spot. It was walking around the projects. Like if someone hadn't taken a video of it and put it on Twitter, that wouldn't have, people just wouldn't have seen that. It's shocking when you see it. And it's what led to the, bad public opinion. So the police decided to drop that contract, right, with Boston Dynamics. So things like that. We work on that stuff. We do all kinds of levels of education, from the basics of current events to, hey, we're going to help you get certified in cybersecurity.
Okay, well, we're at the end of the hour, so I don't want to keep you longer than that. And I put a link in the chat where you can find a recording of this talk afterwards. And I just want to thank you so much for spending some time with us and sharing your work with us. And I learned so much. So thank you again.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the last question, Zoe. Appreciate you. Thank you everyone else for participating, for being here and just giving me your time and your energy. Please share the video and just look into some of the folks, these amazing human beings who are fighting for all of us. Appreciate you.